Hey there friends, it's Haley. Today's gonna be kind of a long video, but I wanted to talk about something that I'm really interested in. So I was a history major in college. I just graduated in the spring, and being a history major who's a huge literature nerd and taking science classes and all that kind of stuff, I got to read a lot of really great books, some of which were actually even assigned to me. So that's what I figured I'd talk about today. Hopefully it'll inspire you to know if you're going to college that there are still some books you're going to find interesting. And if you're not thinking about college but you're just into history and you want to check out some of my recommendations, then I hope you find something you like in this video. I'm not putting these in any particular order. A lot of these are from very diverse different history classes. A couple of them I was recommended in science classes or English, so I figured I would just throw them all together in a heap for you. The first book I'm going to talk about is Adam and Eve and the Protestant Reformation by Kathleen Crowther. This is a really interesting book because it traces the evolution of the story of Adam and Eve throughout the Protestant Reformation, how it changed and what meanings it took on under different interpretations. That might seem a little bland, but there were tons of interpretations of Adam and Eve at the time, and as the Protestant Reformation took hold in Europe and spread outward, lots of different interpretations showed up out of nowhere. We see stage dramas changing, we see translations in the Bible changing to reflect different interpretations that the church wanted or did not want. We see certain theologians interpreting different details to come up with different meanings, and it's all in all it was actually a really interesting study of how people in the 15th and 16th centuries viewed femininity and the story of Adam and Eve as it relates to actual people, medicine, education. There were all kinds of ways that the story was interpreted to impact daily life. So this is a really interesting book, and if you're interested in how the Bible or how mythology has been shaped over time, this one's a really interesting one to check out, specifically on the Protestant Reformation and how the Bible has changed in interpretation. The second book that I really loved being recommended in college is Recreating Africa by James H. Sweet. This is a book that I read for a Brazilian history class, and that's what the book is about, is the foundation of Brazil. Brazil is so much like America when you study the history. I found it very interesting because even though we don't talk about it a lot, Brazil and the United States were both founded on the slave trade and on the exchange of raw products in the Americas for refined products in Europe. There was a lot in common with how these things were run, and although they changed greatly over time and spread out in different directions, this book points out that there were more similarities than there were differences, at least starting out. The book is called Recreating Africa because it has a specific emphasis on West African heritage and religion and society and the aspects of those that were brought over to the Americas when slavery pulled them from their homelands. I think this is probably one of the best books I've ever read on the slave trade because it did emphasize the culture and the humanity of the people while they were still in Africa and what was brought to the Americas when they were sold into slavery. It doesn't attempt to disguise the horrendous things that were done to these people and the really difficult lives that they led once they were here, but it was really interesting to see a scholar talk about the slaves as people, as individuals who participated in a culture rather than just an unfortunate statistic, as I feel many writers actually do. The next book I'm going to talk about is dealing with much more modern issues, but it also mixes in with African American history in the United States and in the Americas, and that is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. This book is about mass incarceration and how privatized prisons in the United States are influenced by the institutions of the Jim Crow era, and further back, the institutions of slavery. This is a bit of a controversial book, especially depending on where you stand as far as mass incarceration and privatization of prisons, but it's a really interesting look at how our perceptions on race have changed over time and the underlying class struggle that has been at the heart of racism and at the heart of the American story since its foundation. This book has gotten a lot of attention, and I think rightly so. The discussions and questions that it brings up are extremely important for everyone to consider, no matter your race or your participation in politics or your perception on the issues at hand. I think everyone has something that they can find in this book that is really interesting and eye-opening, and I think a lot of people could do with reading this perspective. Michelle Alexander has a really compelling writing style, and I think that her research is good, her style is good. There's nothing about this book I didn't enjoy, even if it was hard to read at some points. Next, I'm going to talk about Transgender History by Susan Stryker. This is the only transgender history book I've ever read, but I found it extremely informative. I actually did an independent research project in my last year focusing on transgender history and the erasure of transgender activists in the LGBT movement, and this book was extremely informative on those issues. It revealed so much to me as a trans ally about how we have misperceived the trans movement specifically. I think Susan Stryker does an incredible job of outlining the role of trans activists and just trans people in the United States and internationally, actually. She talks a little bit about transgender activism and changing perceptions on transgender individuals in other countries, since I think this book mostly talks about the 20th century, but there's not a lot of transgender history transcribed that I have found from dating before the 20th century, so I think that's probably why. I think today when we talk about the LGBT movement and the LGBT community, we tend to gloss over the T a little bit. And while I think a lot of people do understand the fundamentals of sexual and romantic attraction, we tend not to think so much about gender because it's complicated and we don't understand it. But that doesn't mean we ignore it, that means we try harder to understand it. I think this book is extremely important for anybody who cares about the LGBT community and who wants to know more about that. I think it's very informative as to why we are where we are now in our history and why certain perceptions about trans people exist, why certain divisions exist within the LGBT community. It's a really interesting, thought-provoking book, and I highly recommend it for any LGBT allies or LGBT people who want to know more about queer and transgender history. The next book I'm going to talk about is called Descent: The History of an American Idea by Ralph Young. This is a book that I was assigned for my senior class on research, and we were encouraged to pick a topic rooted in activism and revolution and things like that. This book starts with skirmishes and revolts dating before the American Revolution and finishes up, I believe, with the 2012 election of Obama. And it covers just a great span of history. I think it's very thorough in its research. It's a really good overview of American history from this perspective. When you are studying America as a nation or as a continent, if you're studying both of the Americas, as a place of change and revolution and new ideas, this book is a really great place to start. The only thing I had a bit of issue with was the lack of LGBTQ representation in its history. The LGBT movement has been especially relevant in the last few years, and I thought that it could have factored in pretty well with some of his last few chapters, which is why I started my research project. Otherwise, I think this is a really good, thorough, interesting look at the history of dissent and revolution in America, and it poses a really great thesis about America, that revolution is an American ideal. Revolution and change and the desire for those things is part of what it means to be an American, and I find myself mostly agreeing with that idea, and I think it's really interesting to see where we will go as a nation with these ideas of revolution behind us, and I think this is a really interesting book to read to get an idea of where we're coming from on that front. The next book I'm going to talk about is actually a graphic novel because I had really cool teachers. This book is called Mendoza the Jew. It is a graphic novel about a boxer from England named Daniel Mendoza. He was a very influential figure in the boxing community and in the Jewish community in England in the 18th century, and this graphic novel provides a really interesting insight into the Jewish community and opinions on Jewish people in England at the time. He went through quite a bit, and I think his life is really, really interesting. And this book by Ronald Schlechter and Liz Clark is just really beautifully and interestingly, is just really beautifully illustrated. There is so much going on in these pages, and it's also accompanied by really thorough research and tons of footnotes so that you can follow it up on your own. And there's so much more to this story, but obviously when you're doing a graphic novel you have to condense a little bit. And I think that these authors found the perfect balance between what to include and what to exclude, what to illustrate and what to explain. This is just a really, really good read, and I think if you're into graphic novels, if you're into history, if you're into boxing, if you're into religious history, any of those things, then I think you're going to like this one. The next book I'm going to talk about is a really interesting one for me to talk about personally. I read the first part of Faust by Johann von Goethe. I was a German minor in college, and I took 3 years of it. I got to study abroad and learn German in Munich, which was one of the best summers of my life. And after we got back, my friend and I decided that we wanted to keep working with the professor who had taken us to Germany with him. So we spent my last semester studying Faust in great detail. We read the entire first part, and then we read selections from the second part. And I think everyone is basically familiar with the story of Faust, but if you're not, don't worry about it. I really wasn't. It's the same basic story as Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, which you might be more familiar with. But actually the story goes back centuries. This is a really old story that did come from Germany originally, I believe, that centers around a figure named Faust or Faustus, who makes a deal with the devil or a demon, however that's interpreted, in order to learn what the human experience is supposed to be like. So in Goethe's version specifically, Faust is an old professor. He has studied philosophy. I keep breaking into German and I don't mean to. My mind is going Philosophie und Medizin and I can't do that. Faust is a professor who has spent his life studying theology and philosophy and medicine and everything he can get his hands on. His life has been all about books, and he is starting to realize at the end of his life that he feels kind of empty. It just hasn't been a full human experience. So he's trying to find a way to open himself up to more experiences, and he starts that off by pursuing dark magic. This doesn't go exactly as planned, mostly because the earth spirit that he summons thinks of him as being very low and undeserving of its attention, but he does attract the attention of a demon called Mephistopheles, who makes a deal with God that he can turn Faust to his side by the time he dies. So then Mephistopheles makes a deal with Faust to teach him the highs and lows of human experience, and the story is mostly about Faust finding a way to enjoy being a human and finding out what it is that is worth living for. This was so much fun and so hard to read. If you're attempting to read it in the original German, as we were, I highly recommend getting a copy like this. This is a Bantam classic, and it has the side-by-side translation. It's a little bit off. I'll warn you that immediately, but I haven't found a translation yet that I thought was almost perfect. Most of them have some sort of error. This one was really good. There are also several online versions that I thought were pretty okay. Just be wary when you're translating that this is not exact. If you try to turn it to paper and you use the direct translation, it's just not going to work. It's pretty close, but as in a lot of translations, they were going for something a little bit more poetic with the English version. So you're going to find several words that are off. Even some of the names are a little bit off. If you get stuck on something like this, I highly recommend looking up other guides to it. There are plenty of spark notes concerning Faust and Dr. Faustus. I think any of those are pretty good to look at. And obviously, if you're really stumped on something that you need to translate or interpret, talk to your professor. Whether it's in English or German, just make sure that you understand what's going on here before you try to write anything about it, because I wrote a few very bad papers. The next book I'm going to talk about is actually a novel. I was assigned this book for a history of science class, Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake. This story is about a man who was friends with the guy who ended the world. Not everyone's a great judge of character. I can't really say too much about this book without giving it away. It's just twisty and turny and Margaret Atwoody. I mean, it's really good. It's very deep, and as always, Atwood has a way with dystopian stories that just itches at you, that just nags at you until you're really, really terrified about everything going on in the world. This one specifically has a lot to deal with human gene editing, and that's been in the news quite a bit recently, so I think that's a really topical subject. And as always, her morals are so interesting, her characters' morals are so interesting. Just give it a read. It's a little bit more adult. I would probably advise trigger warnings for sexual assault and animal abuse, but they're fairly minor subjects and the story is not revolving around those things, so I think you'll be okay if you really want to read this book and you have problems with those things. This book doesn't get talked about as much as Margaret Atwood's other books, especially obviously The Handmaid's Tale, but I really think that this one is just as relevant, just as interesting, and perhaps not as cruel. So if you're a little bit overwhelmed by The Handmaid's Tale, this one might be a little bit better for you. The next book I'm going to talk about is a true classic, and that is Candide by Voltaire. Candide is freaking phenomenal. I have to just be real frank about this one. This is probably one of my favorite things that I've ever read in my life. It's so short. It's the shortest book, like, ever, but it is so good. I haven't read this in the original French, but I have read it in English, and I have had to translate a little bit of it into and from French, and this is... it's just great. It is a wild ride. If you've never read anything of Voltaire's, this is the only thing I've ever read of Voltaire. He is an extremely satirical writer. Take nothing he says seriously. I have to admit, I did not know that. I took Voltaire completely at his word, and then I literally got to the last page and realized that none of it was meant to be taken seriously. And that was hilarious, but I wouldn't recommend it. Just go in knowing that it's not serious. Go in knowing that Voltaire is not an idiot and that his characters are, and be okay with that. This is one of the most fun things I've ever read. I would love to see this story in any format. It is just... it's a treasure. And I highly, highly recommend this to anybody. I don't care what you study. It's really funny and really great. The last book I'm going to talk about that I loved being assigned in college was Up From Serfdom by Alexander Nikitenko. Up From Serfdom is an autobiographical account of a man born into serfdom in Russia in 1804, and it goes through 1824 when I believe he was emancipated from serfdom. And it is an incredible look at what life was like in Russia for people of the lower classes, and how education is so important, and how freedom is so important and takes so many forms. And it's a really humbling, hopeful, sad, interesting story that I really think is worth a read. At some point I forgot that this book had been assigned to me, and I was reading it for fun, page after page after page. I think I cried like 4 times during this book, partly just because it was so good and partly because it is really sad. But it's an incredible look at Russian history and life in Russia, and I think it's a really good book to remind us who are educated, who are free, who are living in developed countries, that we are extremely lucky and that we have a job to do for other people. And I think it's just a really, really good book, and you should read it, because it's really cool. So I was assigned a ton more books in college than just that, but those are my 10 favorites, and so I decided to talk about those. Obviously, most of these were history books. If you're not a huge history fan, honestly, there's not a lot I can do to help you. But I have read some books on science and other subjects that you might find more interesting. If you're curious about other academic books that I've read that I highly recommend, please leave a comment and I will respond to you, and I might even make another video. I think that the books that we read as part of our college and high school curriculums are so important in helping us to grow and helping us to complete our education on our own terms. And so this is a subject I'm really, really passionate about, so I don't mind making more videos about it. If you guys are interested, please let me know. Like this video if you thought it was interesting, and subscribe if you're new here and you want to see where I go next. I hope I didn't bore you guys with academic study, but trust me, some of these books are great even if you're not into nonfiction. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!